Well, just to start off, just tell me a little bit about yourself. How did you become a writer? Why do you think stories are important in the climate action movement?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, start off my process. I wasn't much of a reader as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I had an older brother and sister, and they would read Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew and all those kind of books. And
Mm-hmm.
meantime, I was hiding in the back corner of Williams General Store, buying candy, and reading comics.
Mm-hmm.
Superman, Supergirl, Magnus Robot Fighter. So I
Nice.
was, I just loved those. I ate them up, and he didn't kick me out either. He was a nice man, so I wasn't buying the comics either. I just kind of sequestered myself in a corner, thinking I was, hiding. You know how little kids
Mm-hmm.
are like that. They think they're hiding,
Yeah.
and they're in plain sight, of course, right?
Sure.
But anyway, I was obviously enamored with the fantastic, and
Mm-hmm.
when I did start reading, which I did do. Other than comics, I came across the SF classics,
Okay.
Huxley, Orwell, Le
Yeah.
Guin, Asimov.
Mm-hmm.
Ray Bradbury moved me.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
in fact, his Martian Chronicles made me cry.
Really.
I wanted to write science fiction like him. And I wanted to write science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to move readers like he did with me too. But
Mm-hmm.
here's the thing. I also discovered the classics like
Yeah.
Thomas Hardy. And so, like a beginning author, I imitated my favorites. So
Mm-hmm.
just consider this: Ray Bradbury and Thomas Hardy. That was kind of weird stuff, right?
Yeah.
Genre confused, if you will.
Sure.
So it wasn't until I kind of found my unique voice, which basically blended these, with my
Mm-hmm.
passion for the environment, and which I had as a kid. I was against littering. Littering was a pet peeve. In fact,
Yeah.
it still is. So to answer your other questions, though, I think that stories help us define ourselves and our
Mm-hmm.
role on this planet. We
Mm-hmm.
live by the narratives we tell.
Right.
And climate fiction and eco-literature and solar punk
Mm-hmm.
particularly provide us with important narratives that both entertain and because they entertain, they can also educate.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking cautionary tales to constructive visualizations of a potential future. We're talking
Right.
optimism, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
an important aspect of that.
Right. Cool. Yeah, it's funny. I didn't really get into science fiction until I was much older. So, it's funny because now that I do this podcast, like most of what I talk about is science fiction, but
It's science fiction.
yeah, but my dad had all those books and I would always see them on his bookshelf when I was a kid, like Asimov, like the
Neat.
Foundation series and stuff like that. So
Yes. Yeah.
I still need to go back and do
iRobot.
it. Yeah.
And read them all again. They're cool. They're so cool. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I kind of started with science fiction, and like I said, I dipped into the classics and I got literarily confused, and then I
It
came out at
happens.
the other end,
Yeah.
impassioned through the environment, and I was writing eco-fiction and
Hmm.
climate fiction long before those terms came about, right? Those are terms that we only use nowadays in the past 5-10 years.
Uh-huh.
But I was writing those things long ago.
That's
Yeah,
great.
it's
Cool.
interesting.
Your new novel, A Diary in the Age of Water, which I just finished reading, is the story of a young girl in the future who she discovers a diary from a Canadian woman who wrote about her experiences living through a time in Canada when water is becoming increasingly scarce. Most of the story, I think, is set in about the 2040s. So
Yep.
what inspired you to write this book?
Wow. Well, lots of things. Okay, number one, I'm a limnologist. I'm a water scientist. That's
Mm-hmm.
a limnologist is someone who studies fresh water,
Okay.
like an oceanographer. We study systems, not just
Gotcha.
ecology, but everything else,
Okay.
chemistry, physics, etc. And I've always I've got a whole other story about how I became interested in water. But suffice to
I'd
say
love to
that
hear that
water
too.
Well, yeah. Well, I started out being scared of water, and I turned that into a fascination. And that
Mm.
fascination became a calling, and I took that on as a as a career.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd always wanted to write about water, both nonfiction and fiction. I write nonfiction as well, quite a bit,
Okay.
and more for the lay public to educate them about water. So I created a book called Water Is, and it was published by Pixel Press in 2016. And in fact, Margaret Atwood even liked it.
Whoa. That's a big honor.
Yeah, that was very cool.
Cool.
She talked about it in the New York Times, which was I had no
Wow.
idea. I had no idea she was going to do that.
That's
Anyway, so this book was essentially my way of introducing water to the world from a limnologist's point of view, but in lay language. So all the things that mean something to people about water. So the subtitle is the meaning of water, and it's discusses, essentially it's like a biography of water from many different angles. So that was my first thing in 2016, and then I went from there. I was really into water, and then my Italian publisher in Rome invited me to write a short story about water and politics in Canada. They're all political over there, right? Everything has to be political in Europe. So, I mean, I've been long thinking about potential ironies in Canada's water-rich heritage. As you know, Canada has a huge amount of water at any given time. So the premise I wanted to explore was the irony of people in a water-rich nation experiencing water scarcity.
Okay.
And if you think that's an oddity, we need to look around and to see that it's actually happening in places. So this is someone living under a government-imposed daily water quota of, let's say, 5 liters of water. Meantime, water bottling companies and utility companies are just doing whatever they want with it, right?
Sure.
So I named this story The Way of Water. And it was essentially about a young woman. Her name is Hilda, in near future Toronto, who's run out of water credits for the public WTAP. In this world, water is public and you have to buy it, right? It's not unlike what happened in Detroit, where they shut off all the taps. So houses no longer have potable water. Their taps have been cemented shut. And the only way to get water is through the public tap at great cost. So she's standing there 2 meters from water in a line of people waiting to use a tap. And she's run out of credits. And she's dying of thirst. So that short story begged for a novel, really. So the next piece of inspiration came when I attended a talk by Maud Barlow. She's with the Council of Canadians on her book. Her book is called Boiling Point, and it's about the water crisis in Canada. And we do have one in Canada.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
We could talk about that for an hour.
Interesting is the right word, but
yeah. Anyway, the talk was in a church, gorgeous place, and great acoustics. And I noticed up in the balcony a young mother and her little 6-year-old girl, up in the balcony. And I wondered, what kind of mother would bring her little girl to a political talk about water in Canada? So the diarist character, Lina, and her mother Una, were born. I mean, right there and then I came up with these characters, right? Wow. And it went from there. Lina became the diarist in this book. And she writes about not just water shortage, but water-related phenomena like climate change, habitat destruction, hormone disruption, and the alarming increased infertility in humans. Another main theme that runs through the book.
Cool. Yeah, that was something I wanted to ask about because I thought it was funny. Coincidentally, I just finished reading another book for an interview that I did actually a few days ago. It was a book called Mankind by C.C. Berkey, excuse me. But it was all about that. It was kind of similar. I mean, the books are very, very different, but his book is set in like a future Colorado when water's extremely scarce, and everyone is infertile because of hormone disruptors. So I was like, oh, there it is again. So
exactly.
Was this something you were wanting to raise
It's
awareness about with your book, or how did that get in there?
oh oh definitely, definitely.
Mm,
I had that in mind. It wasn't one of the main things, but it kind of
sure.
crept in, funnily enough.
Okay.
Um, I mean, I do hope that rising infertility becomes a bit more on the radar because it's something that seems to embarrass us. Something
Right.
it's like we need to hide it under the rug,
Mm-hmm.
like our misbehaving Uncle Zeke. Um, you know, if we don't talk about it, we can't understand the underlying reasons
Mm-hmm.
for it. Which, as you said, one of them is endocrine
Right.
disruption, and that's something that I study in the water sciences. I mean, that's one of the places where it's
Hmm.
happening.
Interesting. Yeah, in his book, it was microplastics, I think, that was causing the endocrine disruption. But yeah,
Uh-huh.
that was a reading both of these books was really eye opening for me because I had recently seen articles saying that like male genitalia is shrinking because of because as a
Yeah,
consequence of the climate
yeah,
crisis. But I wasn't actually aware of the fertility or I
yeah,
guess the I don't know if you could call it a crisis
yeah.
yet, looming fertility
It
crisis.
is
Yeah.
actually. The
Mm,
the statistics are alarming. You need to read
okay.
this book. By the way, anybody who's listening,
Mm-hmm.
I the character Daniel gives a really good. He's my narrator in a
Oh,
way.
Daniel.
He gives a,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
Daniel. He gives a really good description of what's going on, and what's
Mm-hmm.
causing it because it's much more prevalent and oppressive. Oppressive isn't the right word, but prevalent in
Mm-hmm.
a insidious way than we may realize. It's right. I mean,
Hmm.
car exhaust,
Right.
PCBs,
Yeah.
various other toxic chemicals that seem to enter into our everyday living experience
Hmm.
contain endocrine disrupting elements. It's
Yeah.
something we need. If we're not aware of it, we're not going to do anything about it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. And that's, I don't know, it's like one of those things. Recently, I guess like in the past year or so, my wife and I have really been trying to make much more of a concerted effort to only buy like organic produce if we can and just like organic
Definitely.
everything.
Yeah.
And I had originally started wanting to do it because of pesticide use and just
Yep.
non-organic produce. And, there's like, we're nearing like colony collapse or hive collapse, I think is what it's called, where we're just killing insane amounts of
All the
insects through
bees.
pesticides. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 So,
Bees
um,
particularly. Yeah.
yeah, so that's what I
Pest.
was worried about when I first started doing it. But yeah, there's also the endocrine disruptor aspect of it too.
Yeah. I mean, yeah,
Hmm.
if you want a personal reason, that's it. But there are so many other
Yeah,
indirect reasons for
right.
being careful about that as well. Yeah.
Hmm. So I wanted to talk about politics a little bit. I know you were saying in Europe
Okay.
they have to make everything about politics, but we're going to talk about politics too, I guess. So, yeah, in your
Sure.
book, politics, well, and like big business corporations are huge parts of the novel. So, like as you say, water's been privatized, all the taps in people's houses have been cemented shut, and there's this company called Canada Core, which is this huge, I guess, kind of like it's almost like a government sort of sized corporation,
Hmm. Yeah.
and it is essentially in control of all of Canada's drinking water. It's the one that instituted the pumps, like you were saying, where people have to buy water with
Yeah.
credits. So, given that Canada is home to such a huge portion of the world's fresh water, which was another thing that I learned in this book, I knew Canada had a lot of water. I didn't realize just how much water it had. I'm wondering what role do you see Canada playing in the future as we're increasingly running short on water?
Yeah. Our role is an interesting one. But just to gain some perspective,
Mm-hmm.
you were mentioning potential water wars, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, you know, it's happening right now, by the way, in the rest of the world. And we
Yes.
kind of almost live in a bubble here,
Yeah, we do.
a bubble of a perception of plentifulness in terms of water. And that's
Mm-hmm.
actually not
Right.
true. A lot of our water is polluted. It's a lot of Canada's water that, we talk about water being, Canada being rich in water.
Mm-hmm.
a lot of it is in the glaciers
Right.
and in the large lakes. So just not that much is potable,
Okay.
and we're using it, and we're actually messing it up just like everybody else.
Great.
I mean, the rest of the world is suffering from a lot of major water conflicts. And you mentioned earlier about the Vice President of the United States
Yeah.
predicting that wars will one day be fought over water.
Yeah, I think she said
And
that just a few days ago. It was kind of wild.
Yeah, she's very right. Just look at the Middle East and Asia.
Yep.
There's tensions between Egypt and I just saw a wonderful, an exemplary documentary on it. They want to, they're up in arms with 9 upstream countries for control of water of the Nile. Right?
Oh, okay.
The Sudanese and the Ethiopians are building dams, and Egypt plans to pump. Right?
I think I saw this.
Yeah, you saw the same one. So Egypt is planning to pump, water from Lake Nasser into the Sahara so they can farm, etc. And then you have India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and China, all in conflict over major rivers, right? The Indus, the Ganges, particularly the Brahmaputra. So I don't know if you know about India's River Link plan. And this is something where they're essentially planning to suck all the. Well, it's going to impact Bangladesh big time.
Yeah, it's right next door.
So meantime, Pakistan and Kashmir and India are fighting over more and more water. And meantime, the Indus is actually drying up.
Okay.
It's like the Colorado. It's no longer flowing into the ocean. But I want to look closer to home, right? Closer to what the vice president was saying, suggesting North America. So, we border Canada and the States border some significant water bodies, such as the Great Lakes, various rivers like the Colorado River in the West. And what we've done is we formed joint commissions along with treaties to manage these transboundary water bodies. Those joint commissions have been, fraught with disagreements and disputes, and highly electrified politically, with political agendas on both sides and that sort of thing. So I'm just reading right now a book by Eileen Delanty-Pirks. It's called A River Captured. And it explores the controversial history of the Columbia River Treaty. I don't know if you know much about that. They built some huge dams over there. So the Columbia flows from Canada through a huge watershed along the Rocky Mountain Trench.
That's
and down
in the Pacific
into the
Northwest,
States.
right?
Yeah, in the Pacific Northwest, exactly. So the dams have already, impacted ecosystems and indigenous peoples all over the map, and local cultures of the Pacific Northwest. So it really didn't go well for Canada, and particularly some of the indigenous peoples. They were just sort of wiped out in a sense, like a semicolon, right?
Yeah.
Another example, the one that's in my book, if you remember it, is from the 1960s. It's the NWAPA project, North American Water Alliance something plan.
APA, yeah.
Anyway, and it was put out by Ralph Parsons' company and the Army Corps of Engineers.
Yeah.
And their thing was to make the entire Rocky Mountain Trench into a giant 800-kilometer long reservoir. It's 500-mile long reservoir to hydrate the U.S., of course.
Yeah.
And that would inundate a fifth of British Columbia's prime habitat, a fifth of BC.
Oh my gosh.
And submerging real big towns, as well as a whole bunch of little towns.
Right.
And of course, indigenous communities, right? And literally destroy the fisheries. Yeah. Literally destroy fisheries, which are, incredibly important in BC. Right. Which is a resource high. Anyway, here's the thing though, Congress seriously looking at it. And it finally went down because of environmental pressures. Right. Pressures from I'm not sure where. But, even Canada was sort of going, is this a good idea?
No.
It's ridiculous.
Oh my God.
If you look on the internet now, the plan is still out there.
Yikes.
It keeps resurfacing between, corporate entrepreneurs,
Yeah, of
engineers, and primarily politicians who see this plan as something that could save the Midwest and the southern parts of the states and California and places that are having problems with desertification, etc.
Yeah. Yikes. Yeah, that I know that ends up happening in the book, but it just makes me think of I don't remember where I heard about this, but apparently, like in World War II, the Nazis were looking at draining the Mediterranean to like turn it into more farmland. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it was something that
I
which
didn't.
sounds absolutely
good
insane,
grief.
but I was just like, that is just like a scale of messing with the earth that
huge scale.
Can't even comprehend that. But yeah, it seems like something on that kind of magnitude, or like the Three Gorges Dam in China.
Exactly.
Which is
same thing.
Just enormous, massive dam.
Humongous. Yeah. It is. We as a species, we do an awful lot of water diversion. I don't know if you know this.
Yeah.
It's a weird statistic or fact that so many we've done so much, and we've diverted and stored so much water, primarily in the northern hemisphere. So much so that we've actually affected the rotation of the earth by some minuscule thing,
right.
but
still
that has because of the excess weight of water being held in the northern hemisphere versus the southern hemisphere. All that water that's sitting there has literally changed the balance. That's when you think of it that way on a global scale. It's that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, that's one word for it. Scary.
Oh, yeah.
Scary also comes to mind.
Scary's another word. Yeah, this is true.
Yeah, for sure. So speaking of entrepreneurs and politicians, big business, obviously, like I was saying, is a huge theme in this book. And I mean, we kind of see this in other things. Like there's a bigger question that kind of gets at this too. But the whole time I was reading this, I was really wondering if there is ever a point when big business or industry and sustainability are actually compatible. There's, I think you mentioned at the beginning of our talk, like literary movements and cultural movements like solar punk kind of imagine a future where it's more like DIY and emphasizes more like small business and big corporations and stuff. But, there's a massive conversation about this right now. Like Naomi Klein has a whole book about this, and which is, I started to read it. I haven't finished it quite yet, but I will get around to it. But I mean, can we have capitalism and a planet that we can live on? I guess.
Now there's the question, right? Because I think that's polarized people quite a bit.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, I would say, and even I go back and forth a bit sometimes in thinking, it kind of depends on how you see things. So I'm thinking mostly economists would say definitely yes.
Yeah.
This is possible. All we need to do is be conservationist in our approach to doing business. But of course, the problem is, what does that mean? And how do you do that? Because the very basis of capitalism is exploitation.
Right, yeah.
It's not conservation.
Yeah.
So the driving force behind capitalism is actually fear and uncertainty. Its main process is exploitation.
Right.
From an ecologist perspective, this actually makes sense. It makes sense for a community during its early succession and growth stage. So when a community first settles, let's say moss on a rock or something, there's a certain process that occurs. It's called succession. So one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another.
Okay.
So when it first colonizes, so we call this approach R selected for rate.
Okay.
So it has a certain approach, a certain way of doing things, a certain way of reproducing, a certain way of acting, of getting its food, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And it's all based on being profligate and growing fast and growing everywhere, right? Colonize everywhere like a bacteria or something, right? or like seeds, right?
Mm.
All annual plants are selected because that's how they promote
Okay.
themselves.
Yeah.
Right. So here's the thing, though. Once we reach a climax community and our carrying capacity, which means you don't want to go beyond that,
Right.
because then you're going beyond what can carry you. This is where we are now.
Mm-hmm.
Then the R selected approach no longer works.
Mm.
And so we've got an economic model based on that approach.
On the R selected
we need
approach.
we need one that matches the new paradigm,
Okay.
not one based on continued growth, right? And this is where a climax global economy, I don't know if you've heard that term, comes into play. It's based on cooperation,
Okay.
not competition.
What a concept.
Yeah, honestly, Elizabeth Sarturis, she's an ecologist visionary, calls this ecological economy. She has a name for it. She calls it ecosophy.
Okay.
So it brings philosophy of ecosystem into economics.
Gotcha.
Daniel Christian Wall, also in his book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, he talks about changing our evolutionary narrative from one based on fear, defined by a perception of scarcity, competition, and separation, to one based on love, defined by perception of abundance and a sense of belonging, collaboration, and inclusion. See the difference?
Yeah.
Now, one might seem naive, but only if you look at it on the surface. If you look at it deeply, you can see that it makes sense.
Right.
And this is something that the indigenous peoples have always known and always practiced. I don't know if you know the author Robin Wall Kimmerer.
I do, yeah.
She wrote Braiding Sweetgrass. She also wrote a book called Gathering Moss.
Yep.
Beautiful metaphoric tale of how to live, in fact, looking at moss as our teacher.
I actually listened to a podcast episode, her talking about moss, and it was just mind-blowing.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
And what she brings in, she's an amazing speaker.
She is,
but she talks about a gift economy.
Okay, yeah,
so it's an economy of abundance. And the basis lies in recognizing the value of kindness, sharing, and gratitude.
Right.
It's sort of like that barter approach, right? I give, you take, you give back. The reciprocity involved there, right? So this is what she says. This is a quote. Climate change is a product of this extractive economy, the one we're in right now. And it's forcing us to confront the inevitable outcome of our consumptive lifestyle. Genuine scarcity for which the market has no remedy. So that's what'll happen, right? Indigenous story traditions are full of these cautionary teachings. When the gift is dishonored, the outcome is always material as well as spiritual. Disrespect the water, and the springs run dry. Waste the corn, and the garden grows barren. Regenerative economies which cherish and reciprocate the gift are the only path forward. I totally agree with her. To replenish the possibility of mutual flourishing for birds and berries and people, we need an economy that shares the gifts of the earth, following the lead of our oldest teachers, the plants. She's talking about the mosses again there.
Sure.
I mean, what a concept.
Yeah.
So seeing the glass full half full as opposed to half empty, right, is in a way really what she's talking about.
That's so great.
And I think a lot of people are going that way. I think that discussion is happening.
Yeah, I think so too. I'd heard that term gift economy before. I'm totally drawing a blank on the author who wrote about it, but there's another podcast that I listen to sometimes called the Green Dreamer podcast. That's hosted by Kamea Shane, I think is her name. But yeah, she interviewed an author who lives in Asheville, North Carolina, and he wrote this whole book about the gift economy, and she had him on there talking about it. So I thought that was just so interesting because I'd never come across that concept before. But yeah, it is like you were saying, just based on this idea of abundance instead of scarcity and cooperation instead of competition. And that totally just flips everything that we do right now on its head. So
it It is, and it's beautiful.
It is,
She
yeah.
gives some she gives excellent examples, and I mean we could go into that forever, but
Sure.
suffice to know, we need to be reading this. We need to be discussing this.
Yeah.
It's out there. It's being written about, and I'm glad that I was able to share it with you today.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I think it's a conversation that needs to continue to happen.
For sure. Yeah, I was just talking with somebody else. Braiding Sweetgrass has been on my to-read list for a really long time, but so have like a million other books, and I just haven't gotten into it yet.
Yeah, this is true.
Yeah, that's the
This is
problem.
true.
So, but yeah, we were just talking about doing a book club over Braiding Sweetgrass potentially. So I really hope that happens. I think that'd be super cool.
It would be
Yeah.
very cool.
Yeah, I would love
Very
to do
cool.
that. And yeah, there's this I feel like anytime we have this discussion about like can capitalism I guess stick around if we're gonna, keep the earth. I feel like a lot of people who are pro-capitalism will say, well, if you just like left people to their own devices, like capitalism is just a system that would naturally arise or whatever, and they always point to nature as like proof of that, and they'll be like, in nature, like different species compete for resources, but the more that, I mean, I'm certainly not a biologist or a scientist by any stretch of the imagination, but like I feel like the more that I do learn about science, the more I come across people talking about the different kinds of relationships that different species have. It's not always just competition.
Yeah.
And you talk about that a lot in your book, which I thought was so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the problem in our philosophy. We, in anyone's philosophy and beliefs, you can pick and choose. Nature offers so many examples of just about everything.
Yes.
And we're only by looking you can find, and we haven't been looking. This is the whole problem is up to, quite recently, to be honest, examples of altruism were not looked for. And therefore were not found, but they're there. Examples of commensalism, huge numbers of positive symbiosis are out there. Communities, interspecies, helping each other. I mean, nature's full of it.
Yeah.
It's just a question of finding it and seeing it.
Yeah.
And this is again, it comes back to the story, comes back to the narrative. That we need to be changing that narrative. And that's why this podcast and others like it are so important, because it puts it on the map. We start by discussing it. That's the first step.
Yeah, totally.
And then we start to think it, and then things change with that.
Yeah, it makes me think of, I don't remember the exact quote. I'm very loosely paraphrasing here, but I think it was Richard Dawkins once said that if like there was a god,
friend,
your friend Richard Dawkins.
Oh my God!
Do you have a lot of strong opinions on him? I don't know too much about him.
I
so
do.
Yeah,
I do. I just find everything he says illogical.
Okay,
it's terrible.
Yeah, well, I totally get that.
Terrible.
Yeah, but there was some quote about him. So when I was growing up, I was raised in the church, and I went to a very small, like, private Christian school. So one of the classes that I had to take growing up was an apologetics class. So for everyone who doesn't know, it's not a class on how to apologize. It's supposed to be a class on how you defend the faith with reason. So like a lot of our time was spent looking at videos of, atheists debating, I guess, with Christians. And yeah. Apologetics is a whole other thing that is interesting to talk about, but
sure is.
I remember there was it might have been a debate or like a speech that Richard Dawkins gave where he said something like if there was like a loving God who used evolution to create, then he wouldn't want to believe in that God or something to that effect, because evolution is so violent and cruel, and he wouldn't believe that was a loving God who chose to use that system to create life, I guess. So, but I mean,
my response to that is the reality and the world in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, that's true. So,
Period. Period.
uh-huh.
Because I see a different world
Mm-hmm.
than that.
Yeah.
A very, very different world.
Yeah.
And if you choose to see the world like that, then that's your choice. But believe me,
Yeah.
that's not the only way the world exists.
Yeah. I'm starting to learn that
it's-
more and more,
yeah.
which is really cool because, I mean, that was just what I always taught growing up was, like species like just kill each other over resources and stuff. But as you say, like, no, they actually help each other out, and there is a lot of altruism in nature. So
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, there is a lot of violence.
Yeah,
There's
there is that
also
too,
a
but
lot of the
yeah.
opposite.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of cherishing, of love, of playfulness. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we're just finding out,
Yeah.
How playful animals
They really are, yeah. Which I don't know why that's so surprising,
yeah.
but it seems to be for some reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, it comes down to what we looked for
Mm-hmm.
and what we didn't look for. It
Yeah.
really comes down to that more than anything.
I think that's really cool. I love like hearing about that stuff. I just think it's awesome. So switching gears a little, I could talk about it for so long, but
Okay.
switching
Same.
gears just a little bit. A lot of the diary entries, because I think in the book, Lena, the writer of the diary, she was born in 2016, or was it right before then? I'm forgetting now.
Just before that.
Okay. Yeah, because I know that she talks a lot about like the Trump administration, like speaking of it in the past, like a long time in the past. But she makes frequent reference to the post-truth era, which I mean like has been coming, I feel like, for a long time. And like George Orwell wrote about it at least like as recently as 1984. But I mean, I'm sure that the wheels were already in motion before then as well. But I guess people, as soon as Trump was elected, and there was that one day on the news when Kellyanne Conway said that something was an alternative fact, which immediately just was like so triggering to everybody who's probably ever read 1984 and was like, oh my gosh, it's happening.
I know.
Yeah, so
I couldn't believe it when I heard
know
that.
It was just, and I feel like she said that just because I just feel like there wasn't a lot of thought that went behind a statement like that, but it carried a lot of weight, and regardless of whether she meant that or not, like
Sure did.
it really like kind of encapsulated a lot of what we were going through then and still are going through. It feels like it's actually getting worse now. But yeah, so this is a huge question because now that we can't delay action on climate change any longer. Like, I mean, we're already acting too late to stop a lot of the worst effects, but we really can't put it off any longer now. But now we have this problem of like post-truth, and like in the United States, like the Republican Party is just completely like out of touch with reality. And it's not even that they just like they like don't really believe the science. It's like much more cynical than that. They're just rejecting reality and replacing it with their own reality because they like it better almost. Yeah. And I feel like I'm getting kind of similar vibes from the Conservative Party in Canada at times. Especially with like the recent news that came out. I forgot who was it. Doug Ford, who was saying that that they weren't going to like recognize that climate change was real or something like that. So anyway. But yeah, I mean, I just am wondering, like, how do we push for climate action? How do we actually make progress on this kind of thing when we do seem to be dealing with people who literally aren't in the same reality as we are? It's just kind of maddening trying to work out this problem. Yeah. What's your answer?
I have no answer for that.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone does.
But seriously though, if you look at it, how do you convince someone about an evidence-based truth when they're living a faith-based or agenda-based?
That's a good way to
right?
put it.
They're totally different. I've been a scientist for a lot of my life, and I just, I find the whole thing incomprehensible. But okay, here's some advice that I did hear from a really good TED Talk given by a neat lady. I can't remember her name, unfortunately. And she said that those two don't can't mix, right?
Right.
They really can't.
Mm-hmm.
So you appeal to a person's compassion,
Hmm.
appeal to their kindness, their links to family and friends. In other words, find some common ground through their humanity
Yeah.
in whatever phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say it's a local manifestation of climate change,
Right.
like something going on. Then work from there. So keep it local and practical
Yeah.
and non-threatening. In other words, take the science out,
Mm-hmm.
take the belief out, and appeal on humane grounds.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that you can't convince someone to change their belief,
Right.
because that's what it is, right?
Yeah.
But you might be able to persuade them to accept an aspect of something
Mm-hmm.
if it doesn't threaten their belief.
Right.
That's the only thing I can think of, because it's a tough one.
It is,
when
yeah.
you're totally in different camps, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you think differently,
Mm-hmm.
and it is a question of thinking, but it's also a question of believing.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me a lot. I actually took a on Coursera, it's like the website where you can take classes from, like different universities and stuff at extremely discounted or sometimes free. And you
Yep.
get like a digital certificate or something that you took the class. So I took one
Cool.
last year. Yeah, it's a really cool platform. A lot of it is, like how to code and stuff like that, which is great if you don't want to shill out like $100,000 to go to a 4-year private university, which,
Right.
speaking from experience, would not advise that. But yeah, I took a class on there from the Yale Center on Climate Change Communication. And it was public health and climate change communication, which was super interesting because I actually started taking it before the COVID-19 pandemic started.
Good for you.
And they were all talking about, like how unprepared we are for a pandemic and stuff. And then, lo and behold, one hits.
And then boom.
Yeah. So,
isn't that funny?
yeah, but that is something that they
Not so
talked
funny.
about. Yeah. Not so funny, but yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what the word would be. Coincidental, ironic, maybe. Yeah.
Ironic.
Yeah.
Ironic.
But,
yeah, definitely ironic.
yeah, but that is something that they talked about was just like appealing to people's humanity. And it's funny how strange language is and how inadequate it is in a lot of times for talking about things like this, because you can...
That's a very good point.
Yeah, because I mean, I remember one thing that they mentioned was, with if you are like talking to somebody who's, I guess, like a climate change denier, or if they are more like conservative in their beliefs or their political opinions or whatever, for some reason the word conservation really resonates strongly with them, whereas we would say like regulation and stuff like that. And so it's just funny because
that's very smart. That's really smart for us. That it comes down into, and you see how that blends in with the belief, right? Because based on your belief, you're going to use languages in a certain way, and your terms are going to vary. So understanding that is also part of bridging that gap, because that's what it is, a big gap between ways of speaking, doing, and thinking, and somehow finding that middle ground where you're not misunderstanding each other.
Right.
And hopefully you make some little baby steps from that.
Totally. Yeah. Easier said than done. It is it's so hard to do it.
I think so. It is.
And I lived in Nashville, Tennessee for a long time, and I'm originally from Georgia, but I moved back here after the pandemic started. But so now that I'm back here, like all my family lives here. I see my grandparents and extended family a whole lot more, and they're all very conservative. But it's just funny because you'll be driving down the street and, here in the metro Atlanta area, we have a huge problem with urban sprawl, like many cities do. So, there's just my grandparents originally, on my mother's side, they moved way out in the country because they didn't like living so close to the city. They both are from the country, like in South Georgia and Alabama. So they really don't like city life, and they were wanting to get out to, like where it's a lot quieter and not as developed. So, but now that, sprawl is catching up, they're, clear cutting tracts of land and putting up, like a grocery store, something dumb like that. but just something we don't need. We're like, there's one like 10 minutes down the street
Yeah,
in the other
yeah.
direction. Why do you need another
Oh,
one?
I know.
But
What? Another mall,
yeah,
another mall.
yeah, or like a Walmart,
Uh,
yeah.
oh
But you'll be
dear.
going past
Yeah.
it, and like my grandfather will always be like, they're just ruining everything. Like, it's so sad that they're cutting down all the trees. And I'll just be like, did you really just say that? Like, because that sounds like
Yeah.
something I would say. And we're probably like, I mean, I don't talk to my grandparents about politics, but we're probably like as far on the polar opposite side of things politically as we could be. So, yeah.
Yeah. But see, that's a good example
Mm-hmm.
of you're both lamenting, but probably your values of that are
Right.
different,
Yeah.
but you're lamenting it for a reason. And
Mm-hmm.
somewhere in there you come together, you
Right.
can overlap, but the reasons are different.
Yeah,
And I
totally.
think that's the challenge, is to
Mm.
find to find and respect those other reasons, those
Mm-hmm.
different reasons.
Yeah.
Come to whatever,
Yeah. It's just
a
something.
common
Yeah,
conclusion.
we'll have to figure it
Yeah.
out sooner or later, I guess. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I guess talking about like the kind of tendency to control, and how you were talking about the dams that they're building and how that displaces so many Indigenous and First Nations peoples. I wanted to kind of talk about colonialism and how it's tied to the climate crisis. I recently finished reading this book called The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh, who's
Yes.
an Indian writer. Yeah.
Yeah.
And a
Yes. I know.
huge aspect of that book, I
Oh,
mean, one part of it is, how do we write stories about climate change? But then another huge aspect of it
yes.
is like imperialism and colonialism, and how that has essentially caused climate change. But I mean, we still see this in your novel, like in the 2040s, like you were saying, they've built this reservoir and they've just dammed up huge swaths of British Columbia and just turned it into water to sell to the Americans, basically, because we've
Yeah.
run out of
Yeah.
water down here.
Yeah.
But I mean, things like this are happening still today. I mean, we have like American oil companies in South America that, use colonialist practices to exploit countries there for their oil, and now like things like lithium mines and stuff too, now that we're building more batteries. But I was really
Yep.
thinking of what's happening right now in Minnesota with the Line 3 pipeline that is currently under
Yes.
construction. So, this was crazy when I started reading about this. There's a climate journalist that I read named Emily Atkin, and she has this newsletter that I subscribe to called Heated. But yeah, she was talking about how Enbridge, which is a Canadian energy company, they basically like paid off
Yeah.
the local police departments there in Minnesota to kind of, I don't know
Yeah.
if private army is like the right word, but
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
kind of,
Mercenaries.
yeah,
Mercenaries.
basically, yeah, they're kind of like a private, security company,
Private. Yeah.
even though they're supposed to be protecting the people who live there in that community. But a huge part of this is that the Line 3 pipeline is going through traditional indigenous lands, and they're actually even tunneling underneath the Mississippi River to build this in one part. So, and you were mentioning earlier about how indigenous people have known, like how to live more sustainably for such a long time. But I was hoping you would talk a little bit about the importance of protecting indigenous rights in the climate movement.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, and you mentioned, local and traditional ecological knowledge. I think there's an acronym, LTEK.
Yeah.
It literally does lie at the heart of preserving the planet's health and balancing the climate. But what I'm seeing is, which is heartening, very heartening, is that the indigenous people around the world are regaining control.
Yeah.
Of their territorial environments. They're to invigorate their food security and governance and social relations. I have a quote here by Stephen Nita of the Dene First Nation.
Okay.
He says, because of their attachment to and dependence on the land, indigenous peoples have been establishing their own protected areas for millennia. And this is, this is precedence. I mean, this is history.
Right.
They've been doing this for ages and ages. And we're just catching up.
Yeah.
Luckily, though, we are at perhaps more so on a grassroots level, but in some cases on a government level. An example of this is the IPCAs.
Okay.
You know about them? The Indigenous Fed Conservation Movements. I think it stands for Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas.
I don't know.
And these are areas that are Indigenous led,
Okay.
right? So they're the primary role in protecting and conserving ecosystems through Indigenous laws.
Okay, yeah.
And their knowledge system. And it's linked to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's UNDRIP, specifically their Articles 29 and 32. I won't read them all out, but they're awesome.
Cool.
The idea, though, is that the Indigenous govern themselves and their territories to conserve and protect them, and they actually have the right to do so. So in British Columbia in Canada, this is happening quite a bit.
Okay,
There's
cool.
a lot of examples with the Plaquit and the Haida. Here's an example, though, which one that I've been following for a bit, and it's the Heiltsuk Nation in the Great Bear Sea.
Okay.
They actually enacted, so they've been, enacting Indigenous law. They've enacted on what they call an Oceans Act to protect what they call their oceans relatives, which is wonderful way of saying
I love that.
Particularly the Pacific herring. This is a keystone species that they rely on, and a lot of people rely on.
Yeah.
So the Heiltsuk herring relationship has thrived over millennia through a system of traditional ecological knowledge, something called Guilas, which encompasses all that and the oral teachings, and primarily a sustainable harvesting practice, which I won't go into because it involves the adults versus the roe, et cetera, what's harvested, et cetera. So under the current legislation overseen by DFO, commercial fisheries are pretty much destroying that herring fishery through unsustainable practices. They're not doing it the same way.
Yeah.
So even though Heiltsuk's stewardship and governance in this area was recently recognized by Canada, by the provincial and the federal government, DFO continued to operate separately with settler law. So they were opening the herring seine fishery in violation of the Heiltsuk constitutional rights. So there's this giant conflict happening since 2015, hugely. Seems like the latest I heard is that they finally collaborated. They're collaborating. That's what they have to do.
Right.
Again, it comes down to two parties meeting and talking to each other. And we're working it out. So it's an ongoing conversation, and I think it's moving forward with much more recognition.
That's great.
Yeah.
I remember seeing recently. I believe it was in Quebec. There was a group of Indigenous people who had won a court case to establish rights for a river there in Quebec. I think I saw that recently.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, I just thought that was so great. And I was talking to, when was it? It was back a few months ago, but me and my friend Lovis Geyer from Scotland, we did an episode together on The Overstory by Richard Powers. And
I love that book.
Yeah, it's a good one.
I love that
It's really
book.
good. But we were talking about rights for nature in that episode because one of the character narratives in that book talks about that a lot. But yeah, I think that originally started in New Zealand with the Maori people, and it's now kind of spreading around the world. But
it is, which is wonderful to see. Yeah,
and
I love that.
And I think it was also the UN put out a report. It might have been, I might be getting it confused with someone else, but yeah, like land managed by Indigenous peoples, like it actually encourages biodiversity.
Yeah, it definitely does. Definitely.
Yeah, which is just so cool. But yeah, so hopefully that's a movement that will continue to gain traction, moving forward. It seems like it is. Picking up steam.
It has to. It has to for us.
Yeah, I agree.
We're depending on it for my children and my children's children. Honestly.
Totally.
Yeah.
Going back a little bit to what we were talking about, the post-truth era, which is such a fun thing to talk about.
Oh, it is.
Yeah, it's just maddening. But one of the things that has made this even worse recently is just the rise of disinformation and misinformation. And I mean,
and conspiracy theories. I guess that's what you mean,
yeah,
right?
yeah, that's tied
All
into
this
it.
conspiracy theory
Yeah,
stuff.
so that was a huge part of your book, especially your character you mentioned earlier, Daniel. Man, he was such an interesting character. But yeah, there's this was it like a social media platform? I was trying to figure out if it was something like a Reddit or I don't know.
Yeah, it's actually sort of more than that, but that's good enough way of describing it.
Yeah. So it was
sort of a platform independent of the internet itself.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
cool.
It's on internet.
Gotcha. Yeah, so it was called Oracle, and he was always on that, just finding stuff. And Lena, the narrator of the diary, is always saying that she was like afraid to go on Oracle because it was just, a rat's nest of conspiracy theories and misinformation and stuff.
Which it was.
Yeah, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Daniel, because I thought he was such a cool character, and talk about what inspired him.
Yeah, he's definitely an oxymoron. Yeah. He's a kind of a twisted hipster version of the Oracle, of an Oracle. He's young, he's wise, but naive too, all at the same time, right? So I kind of brought him in as a trickster archetype, a kind of a foil to Lena. Yeah. We won't give spoilers to the book, but there's some interesting things that happen there, right? So he's her technician and workmate, and he ends up being her link to the world of gossip and dark truths repressed by the corporations via the traditional internet. So he finds these gems in the quagmire of the net to share with her over coffee. So he's really very bright and astute technologist, but he's also naive in some way. For instance, he's a researcher who dabbles in conspiracy theory. Right?
Yeah. I love that.
He's all about health, but he's a smoker. He's a chain smoker. So he's a man of contradictions. And even though he's Lena's coffee companion and amuses her, he's also unsettling her. Right? So in true trickster fashion, he finds out her secret, and of course, we know that he pays for it, right?
Yeah.
His character allows me to explore the best and worst in that diarist character. So he was a lot of fun to write.
Yeah, I can imagine.
A lot of fun to write.
Yeah. Just to imagine this guy. I guess like the dark web is what Oracle is making me think of. It seems maybe a little bit more like that.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is more like that.
Yeah, but I feel like probably everybody has known somebody like Daniel at some point.
Probably. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, definitely.
At least some people probably have,
so you can really like him, but he can be really annoying at the same time.
That was, I feel like that was the thing that Lena said a lot too, is that, he was kind of like her lifeline to knowing like information about what's going on outside, but also he really got on her nerves, and totally understand why.
But he also amused her. He was also company for her and all these things. So there was this, push-pull thing going on between them.
Yeah. So this was another thing that Daniel brought up, though. It was, earlier I asked you if it was possible to live sustainably and also live in a capitalist system, but Daniel asked maybe even like a deeper question that kind of gets a little bit more at the root of that question, I thought, which was, can you save the earth and save humanity too? So this was like kind of a question that really tore Lena apart. So I'm curious to hear what you think is the answer to that question. I'm asking you all the really big questions this evening.
Well,
what's the meaning of life?
What's the meaning of life, Nina? Why is the sky blue? Right. I'd rather answer that one.
That one you actually can answer, so.
So, are humans the root problem, I guess, is what you're saying.
Right.
And, right off the bat, I would say, of course we are.
Yeah.
But, it's far too simple and easy an answer, too. It's like a cop-out. It's the easy way out. And to me, it isn't so much that we're human that's created climate crisis, among other things. It's that most of us live and subscribe to a worldview and a belief system that came from a place of great uncertainty.
Mm.
Talked about that earlier.
Yeah.
With a perception of scarcity and an existential model based on fear and separation. Ancient peoples and most indigenous people today
Mm-hmm.
don't hold themselves separate from the land.
Right.
It's all about the land.
Mm-hmm.
They already live in ecological civilizations.
Right.
And in fact, an ecological civilization is both a new and an ancient idea. Buddhists, the Taoists,
Mm-hmm.
and other traditions base their spiritual wisdom on the deep interconnections of things,
Mm-hmm.
right? So back to Robin Wall Kimmerer, she said that
Yeah.
in indigenous ways of knowing, is to understand that each living thing has a particular role to play.
Mm.
This is gorgeous what she
Yeah.
says. Every being is endowed with certain gifts, its own intelligence, spirit, and story.
Mm.
And the key is to find that gift within us and learn to use it well.
Yeah.
And I think we're starting to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And partly because, as we discussed, we are listening to the traditional ecological knowledge
Mm-hmm.
of the indigenous peoples. We are listening to them. We're, finally taking it seriously and doing some reconciling. And we got a long ways to go, I know, but part of that is in understanding and respecting that as a different way of living.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, I do believe that human nature is basically empathic.
Yeah.
And cooperative, not selfish and competitive. I think we're born the former, and we're taught to be the latter.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, that's what needs to change. How we are taught. The net comes back to the narrative.
Yeah.
What narrative what stories we tell about ourselves.
That's great. I love that. Yeah, it makes me think a lot of this book. You've probably read it before, or at least heard of it, Ishmael by Daniel Quinn.
Yes.
Yeah, it makes me think a lot of that because, one of the big themes in that book was just about like the controlling mythology that we have in our society. And like, it was like, if you went to ancient Rome or something and asked somebody about like a myth of Zeus or something like that, they would give you a funny look and they'd be like, that's not a myth. Like he's a god.
Right.
But he was like, but like at the same time, if somebody came up to you and, said something like, tell me about the myth of like limitless growth or something like that, you would be like, what are you talking about? Like that's the system that we operate in. So I think you're right. Like a lot of that is learning to change the narrative that we kind of have been taught from birth, at least in our culture, which is like a Western culture. But yeah.
The stories that we write are so important. And that's why I'm also heartened by the fiction that I see that's out there right now.
A lot of it's really groundbreaking.
It is. Climate fiction, eco-fiction is not really any longer, even right now, a brand in itself. It's literally taking, how shall I say it? It's like an amoeba. It's going into all other types of literature.
Yeah, it is.
It's part of literary fiction. It's part of science fiction. It's part of any kind of fiction. Heaven forbid, maybe it'll even be part of romance fiction. But the point is, it's infusing this idea of the environment, the importance of environment and climate change and all that has become an underlying theme that's literally going into every form of storytelling.
Yeah.
And when that starts to happen, when the taxi driver in New York tells me about climate change, then I know that it's part of us now, and that we have become a movement ourselves, and we're moving forward.
That's great.
That's very heartening.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it was Margaret Atwood actually who said that it's not climate change, it's everything change. And then I want to say Barbara Kingsolver was saying that, at a certain point, it may have been Margaret Atwood, sorry if I misattribute this quote, but she was saying like at a certain point, like it is going to just be like you will be writing fantasy essentially if you aren't including climate change in what you're writing, because it is reality and it's becoming such a more noticeable part of our everyday experience, I guess. At least here.
Yeah. It could have been either lady, but I'm suspecting it was Margaret.
Yeah. I think you might be right. It sounds more like something she would have said, but
either way, thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Margaret.
Both amazing writers who are writing.
They're both amazing writers.
Yes.
Amazing writers.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
I will talk about their books one day on the podcast. They are like coming down the queue. I just like have so many books to get to, but
Excellent.
I've definitely been looking at them. So I've got a Barbara Kingsolver book over on my bookshelf that was one of the first books that I bought for this podcast, and for some reason I still haven't done it. So maybe that'll be Flight Behavior.
Which one is it? Is it Flight Behavior? I was going to say that's the one I would suggest. I'm also going to suggest another one if you haven't got it in your pile. Bark Skins by Annie Proulx.
Okay, yeah. I just heard about this recently, but it sounds super interesting.
It's amazing.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
600-year-long saga of
Love it.
Basically the logging industry.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
It's wonderfully done.
Cool.
Wonderfully done.
Yeah, I'd love to check that out. So kind of going off the problem, I mean, the question of are humans the root problem? Another thing that comes up with this is overpopulation, and this is a really controversial one. I feel like.
I knew you were going to ask me that.
Yeah. Sorry. You knew I had
That's
to.
All right. No, go for it. Go for it. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and the book that I just mentioned, Ishmael, that was like a pretty big theme in his book, and I'm forgetting now that the writer that he referenced in that book, but they're saying like the problem is the agricultural revolution. Like as soon as we learned how to grow food without hunting it, suddenly population grew. That creates like induced demand for more food, et cetera, and then suddenly we've cultivated everything to turn it into just one big farm. But yeah, this is really controversial in the environmental space because I feel like a lot of people who, are pushing for things like a Green New Deal or just climate action in general, I guess to them, it kind of feels like you were saying earlier, like indigenous people have lived in an ecological society for thousands of years, and it wasn't a problem until, we had like industrialism. So, I mean, do you think that overpopulation is an important thing that we should be talking about, or I don't know, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, that's it. How do you navigate? Because honestly, it sparks conflict.
Yeah, it does.
It polarizes, right?
And conservatives are always like the one-child policy.
They'll go nuts over that. I mean, at the root of it is reproduction and the right to reproduce. Right. It's kind of an impulse, an innate impulse of all life, right?
Of course.
Make more of itself. So we're already in conflict with ourselves. But I agree with Project Drawdown. You mentioned that.
That's a good one to draw attention
earlier. You talked about that. How to enter into kind of a rational and productive discussion on the issue kind of relies on, it relies on the players, their rationale, perspective, and personal feelings. So it's another one of those questions that's so hard to answer.
Yeah.
I know we know there should be fewer of us, right?
Yeah.
We kind of all know this, right?
Of course.
How to achieve it is a whole other matter.
That's the real question.
Do you use Rob Ford's technique or Doug Ford, whatever his name is? God, I don't like the man. And beat them down on the head, saying "Thou shalt." You mentioned the China's policy.
The one-child policy.
But it comes down to ecological footprints more than anything else, and living lightly on the earth, and other philosophical considerations. Here's the thing, though. You and I talked earlier about infertility, right?
Yep.
And the rise, and to me it seems a macabre kind of irony going on with environmental degradation, caused partly by overpopulation,
right,
sparking infertility in humans. So, I mean, is that possibly nature taking care of itself.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to leave it with that. I mean, maybe it'll all just cover itself,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. That's my cop out. I guess
Yeah.
I just find that earlier on, when I was very much a political member of the environmental movement, that was at the forefront, and it took a backseat because of the polarizing nature of it and the fact that it's very conflicting. So I think, to be honest, if you look at one thing and you fix one thing, the other takes care of itself along with it. And I think overpopulation is one of them.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a page on the Project Drawdown website that I'd found, but yeah, I thought it was funny when I first started learning about Project Drawdown several years ago. One of the first things that they recommend doing is educating women, empowering young girls.
Yes.
And it's because of overpopulation, basically.
Yeah. And you would think, what has that got to do with it? It has everything to do with it. Everything to do with it. Because it goes back to what Margaret Atwood was talking about, right? If you change the way we live, what's important to us and how we move and everything, using traditional ecological knowledge, respecting the environment, understanding that the trees are our relatives, shifting our paradigm, everything else comes with it.
Right.
It's just amazing how it settles itself.
Yeah. It's almost like it's kind of just proof of like doing the right thing will make things better, sort of. Because I mean, we just should be investing in educating girls to begin with, like even if overpopulation wasn't an issue. So it just seems kind of like, it's almost like the proof is in the pudding kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I like that.
Yeah.
I like that phrase. Because I like pudding. I really like pudding.
Pudding's good. I won't argue with that. Yeah.
It's great. It's great.
So of course, we're talking about climate change, but the change part of that is another big theme in your book, which reminded me a lot of one of my favorite books, which is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler.
I love that
Yeah,
book.
it's so great. But in that book, the main character, Lauren, she actually creates her own religion called Earthseed.
Yes.
And one of the, I guess, like the main tenet of Earthseed that she always repeats, there's this kind of little book of like, I guess, proverbs almost that she writes that kind of lays the groundwork for it. But she always says, God is change. And then you had a quote in your book from Lena that I thought it reminded me of that a lot. I've got it here. I was going to read it. She said, trapped by our preordained notion of change, we no longer see what we're not prepared to see. And that's the change that kills us. So that got me thinking, then about like biological evolution, everything's changing so fast, like evolution can't really keep pace with it. And then, we get to this question of like infertility, like you were saying, is that maybe nature taking care of the problem itself? But yeah, I don't want to spoil the end of the book, but I think like as you see close to the end of the book, there is a little bit, maybe more of something like this. But I was wondering, like, if you think that there's a point where humans will, I guess, need to, or I think there's probably a point where they will try to take evolution into their own hands, so to speak. Like, I feel like transhumanism is kind of part of that, but yeah.
Transhumanism, CRISPR.
Yeah. God, CRISPR scares me to death.
Oh, it scares me too.
Yeah,
oh,
it's so scary.
It's like putting a bomb in a child's hand.
Yeah.
But anyway, you know what? First, it isn't our intelligence. It's not our cleverness that's going to save us. It's our kindness and compassion. And we don't need to invent some techie thing or reinvent ourselves or implant ourselves with some intelligent virus or something.
Yeah.
We simply need to do what we simply need to do is accept ourselves with humility, find and express joy, give in to the beauty of the world, find beauty and see our own part in it, become a participant. Embrace the feminine, respect nature and all that lies in it. And I always say this, find something out there in nature to love, cherish it and protect it, because that's what we do with something we love. and the rest will follow.
That's great. I really love that. Love that. But yeah, I feel like I've been hearing more people talk about this kind of thing. So I hope that it is kind of like percolating up through the collective consciousness. But yeah, that book, All We Can Save, that came out not too long ago, I feel like a lot of it was about this. And one of my favorite writers, climate writers, Mariana East Hecklar, she had an article that I feel like is one of her more underrated essays about how love is what is going to save us from the climate crisis. And I feel like on the surface, people might kind of scoff, but I think there is something really deeply profound about that.
You know, it's always the simple things, the simple things that are the most powerful.
Yeah.
It always comes down to that.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's probably a good place for us to end our conversation. That's such a great note to end on. I really, really enjoyed your book, A Diary in the Age of Water. So if you haven't read it yet, I'd recommend everybody who's listening right now to go pick up a copy and read it for yourself. But yeah, Nina, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Awesome.
I really enjoyed getting to talk to you.
So did I, Forrest. It was a wonderful conversation. Thank you.